One of the most critical and often overlooked aspects of male hormone health is androgen receptor function, and the reason for this is that it literally doesn't matter how much testosterone you have if your androgen receptors, the receptors that testosterone binds to carry out its biological effect, aren't operating properly. And so in this video, we're going to be taking a deep dive into what androgen receptors are, how they function, and how to optimize their functionality. So let's go ahead and dive in. Androgen receptors are essentially the receptors that androgens like testosterone, DHT, and androstenedione bind to carry out their biological function. Things like increases in muscle mass, improvements in bone health, stimulation of sperm production, as well as simple maintenance of secondary male sex characteristics. Now, generally speaking, androgen receptors are found throughout the entirety of the body in various tissues. However, they're primarily concentrated in tissues like muscle tissue, bone tissue, as well as the testes and the brain, and in other tissues that are heavily dependent on androgen signaling for proper health. Now, interestingly enough, androgen receptors, unlike neurotransmitter receptors, are not actually found on the outside of cells. They're rather found in this cytoplasm of the cell, where hormones must pass through the cell wall and into the cytoplasm of the cell in order to reach and bind to the androgen receptors. Now, in the absence of androgens, most androgen receptors throughout the entirety of the body are typically bound to a protein known as heat shock proteins that help to stabilize the receptor in the absence of androgens. And after this, the receptor then dimerizes, exposing a nuclear localization site, and then travels to the nucleus of the cell, where the receptor then activates and transcribes various genetic factors and activates and deactivates various genes. Now, without proper functioning of the androgen receptors, it literally does not matter how much testosterone you have. You can have extremely high levels of testosterone, but if your androgen receptors are not functioning properly, you will have low androgen signaling and symptoms of low testosterone. And on the flip side of this, it's entirely possible to actually have extremely low levels of testosterone, but if your androgen receptors are functioning at an extremely high efficiency, it's actually possible to have absolutely no symptoms of low testosterone, and is also why there's actually a really good argument to be made that androgen receptor function is actually more important than the levels of testosterone that you have in your bloodstream. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this here just because we have a lot to get through, but it is worth noting that because heat shock proteins are the kind of like default ligand that it is attached to the androgen receptor and helps to stabilize the receptor in the absence of androgens, there's a very strong argument to be made that things like exercise and the sauna, which do increase the expression of heat shock proteins in the body, may have a very fundamental and foundational role in stabilizing androgen receptors. Now, this hasn't been extensively looked at in any research that I'm aware of yet. However, because of the critical functioning role of heat shock proteins at the androgen receptor, it's entirely possible that heat shock proteins are actually one of the most potent ways to improve the functioning of the androgen receptor. Now, when it comes to understanding androgen receptor function and efficiency, there are a couple of definitions that I do want to run through here very quickly, just so we can kind of get a grasp of how androgen receptors function before we dive into how to improve their functionality. And the first one I want to talk about is simply androgen receptor density. Now, density refers to the number of receptors in a given location within the body. And so when you have more receptors in a given location, you're going to have a higher density level. And if you have lower levels of receptors in a given location or space, you're going to have a lower density level. Now, when it comes to density, there's also a couple of other terms that are worth noting here just because they so potently influence receptor density. And one is the receptor expression as well as the receptor stability. Now, receptor expression simply refers to how many androgen receptors are being produced. If you have a higher level of expression, you're going to have a higher number of androgen receptors that are being produced. And then when it comes to stability, stability refers to simply the stability of the receptors, the likelihood that that receptor is going to degrade over time. And so if you have a high level of expression and a high level of stability, you're going to end up having a high density of androgen receptors. Now, when it comes to androgen receptor sensitivity, sensitivity obviously refers to the sensitivity of the receptor to things like testosterone, and is somewhat of a measure of the likelihood that testosterone will bind to something like an androgen receptor. And there's a couple of different factors here as well that influence androgen receptor sensitivity, the first being affinity and the second being transcriptional activity. Now, receptor affinity refers to specifically the affinity of the receptor, the likelihood that testosterone will bind to the receptor. And the higher the affinity of the receptor, the higher the likelihood that it will bind to an androgen if an androgen is present. And then when it comes to transcriptional activity in reference to the sensitivity of the androgen receptor, the transcriptional activity is a measurement or a theoretical measurement, in the very least, of the activity that happens once a ligand like testosterone or DHT binds to the androgen receptor, the activity of the receptor, it going to the nucleus and activating various genetic factors. How likely or how strong is that activity? And so when you have high affinity receptors that have a high transcriptional activity, a higher likelihood of transcribing genetics after being activated, you end up having a high sensitivity receptor. And so if you're trying to improve the overall health, functionality, and efficiency of your androgen receptors, these are the two qualities that we're going to be trying to address: the density and the sensitivity. And there are a handful of ways of doing this. However, in this video, what I want to do is more so focus on the hormonal pathways that augment androgen receptor functionality. And the first one we're going to talk about here is obviously androgens. Now, within normal levels, higher levels of androgens actually tend to increase androgen receptor functioning, which is kind of strange given that most receptors in the body operate on a negative feedback loop, whereby when a ligand in the body increases in its activity, the activity of the receptor tends to decrease to allow the body to reach some sort of state of homeostasis. However, within the context of androgens specifically and androgen receptors actually tend to respond positively to androgens like testosterone. And so what I mean by that is that when testosterone levels are high, you will typically see a higher level of androgen receptors. And the reason for that is when testosterone binds to androgen receptors, it increases the transcriptional activity, it increases the affinity, increases the overall health of the androgen receptor, which allows it to stick around for longer and eventually increases the density of the androgen receptors as well in a particular area. And so generally speaking, if you want properly functioning androgen receptors, one of the best things that you can do is to have healthy levels of testosterone. However, it's worth noting here that this trend doesn't continue on forever indefinitely. If you start injecting testosterone, for instance, it actually starts to have a negative impact on androgen receptor functioning. And on the flip side of this, when you have extremely low levels of testosterone, you will typically also have low functioning androgen receptors. And so the key when it comes to optimizing androgen receptor function is just to simply have healthy levels of testosterone, not too high and not too low. If your levels are too low for too long or too high for too long, you will end up having a negative impact on your androgen receptors. Now, if you're interested in taking a super deep dive into how to naturally optimize testosterone levels, I do have an entire video on this that I'll link at the end of this video. However, there are a couple of other things I do want to mention in this context, and that is exercise and the avoidance of ejaculation. And the reason for that is that these activities, or lack of activities, however you want to categorize them, have been shown to potently and acutely increase testosterone levels. Now, in the hormone optimization space, we typically don't look at these activities as something to meaningfully increase testosterone levels over the long haul because of how acute the effects of these activities are. However, it is entirely possible that these acute spikes in testosterone levels after exercise and because of a lack of ejaculation might actually have an extremely potent effect on androgen receptors. Now, again, this hasn't been extensively looked at yet in any clinical setting. However, because increases in testosterone levels, at least acutely and within the normal physiological range, do appear to improve androgen receptor functioning, it's entirely possible that these activities can in fact improve androgen receptor health and function. Now, because testosterone levels are so important to overall health as well as androgen receptor health, it can be extremely helpful to keep track of your testosterone levels and measure your testosterone levels over a long period of time, and is also why today's video is sponsored by Let's Get Checked. Now, Let's Get Checked has been a sponsor of this channel for years now, and the reason for that is because of how awesome their testosterone test is. It's an at-home testosterone test that they literally send directly to your doorstep, where you get to collect your sample at home, send it back to them. They analyze your test and then will actually give you your results through their online portal just within a few days. And so if you've never had your testosterone levels checked before, or it's been a while since you've had your testosterone levels checked, make sure to check out the link down below for 25% off of an at-home testosterone test. Now, the next hormonal pathway that appears to influence androgen receptor function is cortisol, but not in the way that you might think that it does. Cortisol typically gets a really bad rap in the hormone space for being the hormone that triggers the stress response, which is extremely true. And when cortisol levels are chronically high, it does tend to suppress testosterone levels, since cortisol and testosterone share similar precursors and actually share the same precursor in the body. However, cortisol appears to actually improve androgen receptor function, which is extremely counterintuitive. Now, cortisol appears to do this by modulating various hormonal transduction pathways in the body, as well as reducing inflammation, which does tend to have a positive impact on androgen receptor functioning. However, the main point that I want to make here is that cortisol actually, acutely speaking, appears to have a fairly anabolic and androgenic effect. Acute bouts of stress, not chronic, but acute bouts of stress actually appear to, one, trigger testosterone release as well as improve androgen receptor functioning. And it's only when the acute stress becomes chronic stress that you actually end up running into side effects from elevated cortisol levels. Acutely speaking, rises in cortisol are actually associated with an increase in testosterone, not a decrease, as well as an improvement in androgen receptor functioning. And so it's actually really important that we as guys intentionally engage in stressful situations like exercise and work as a means of activating the cortisol pathway, activating the release of testosterone, as well as improving the functionality of the androgen receptors. But it's also really important to also figure out ways of mitigating that stress, reducing stress levels, so that acute stress that you're intentionally putting yourself under doesn't become chronic stress. Now, what's interesting here is that this idea that acute stress is actually good and beneficial for testosterone levels and androgen receptor functioning is actually supported by the fact that the neurotransmitters associated with the stress response also appear to have a beneficial effect on testosterone levels and androgen receptor functioning. Things like dopamine, things like norepinephrine, as well as glutamate, all appear to have a beneficial effect on androgen receptor functioning, as well as being involved with the stress response. And so while chronic stress is a really bad thing, and chronic elevations in dopamine, norepinephrine, glutamate, and cortisol are not good, not healthy for your body whatsoever, acute releases of these neurotransmitters and hormones do in fact appear to be beneficial for androgen receptor functioning. Now, the next hormonal pathway that I want to talk about here is actually a set of hormones that have very similar functions, so I'm kind of going to just group them here together, and that is insulin, IGF-1, and leptin. Now, the reason I'm grouping these hormones together is because they all are released in response to adequate caloric intake, as well as, to a lesser extent, carbohydrates and protein. Now, leptin, IGF-1, and insulin all appear to have a very positive impact on androgen receptor health, density, and efficiency in The reason for this is primarily by improving the stability of the receptors, because leptin, IGF-1, and insulin all are released in response to high caloric intake and high nutrient intake. It makes sense that these hormones would have a positive impact on stabilizing the proteins that are found in the androgen receptor for the purpose of improving their stability and density. Now, if you're trying to intentionally optimize and increase the levels of these hormones, by far the most important factor to pay attention to here is your caloric intake and your nutrient intake, because these hormones are released in a response to adequate amounts of calories and adequate amounts of nutrients. If you're not getting enough calories and nutrients, you're going to have hindered levels of leptin, insulin, and IGF-1 that's going to have a negative impact on your androgen receptors. However, it's also worth noting here that there's also a handful of very specific nutrients that appear to have an independent and notable impact on these hormone levels independent of caloric intake. And those would be things like protein, carbohydrates as well. Carbohydrates are very potent at stimulating insulin. Protein is extremely potent at stimulating the release of IGF-1 as well as leptin. Carbohydrates and fat also are extremely potent at increasing leptin levels. But there's also some very specific vitamins and minerals that have been shown to, one, improve the release of these hormones, as well as influence androgen receptor functioning through those mechanisms. And those would be things like zinc, magnesium, vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin A, and there's also a handful of other vitamins that have been shown to influence these metabolic pathways. And so one of the things that's really worth understanding here is that your body does tend to prioritize reproduction, things like testosterone production, sperm production, androgen receptor health, when you have adequate amounts of food and nutrients. And so if you are either lacking caloric intake or any one of the particular nutrients that affect androgen health and androgen receptor functioning, there will be a reduction in androgen receptor health, as well as a reduction in leptin levels, insulin levels, and IGF-1 levels. And so again, if you're trying to optimize androgen receptor functioning through optimizing leptin, insulin, and IGF-1, the main thing to really pay attention to here is to make sure that you're getting enough calories and enough nutrients. And this would also apply to things like L-Carnitine. L-Carnitine is really one of the only supplements and nutrients that has hardcore clinical data to support the fact that it can increase androgen receptor density. And we really don't understand entirely why this is quite yet. However, one of the leading theories is simply that carnitine is able to signify to the body that there is enough ATP, enough energy, enough calories coming in, and enough nutrients coming in to support energy metabolism in the body, which then allows the body to prioritize sexual health, the production of testosterone, as well as the receptors that testosterone binds to. Now, another hormonal pathway that appears to increase and improve androgen receptor function is growth hormone. And I find this one to be particularly interesting because of the fact that growth hormone, unlike insulin, IGF-1, and leptin, is a counter-regulatory hormone, which simply means that it's released in response to low levels of blood glucose. And the primary point of growth hormone being released by the body is to mobilize fatty acids and amino acids for the purpose of gluconeogenesis and increasing the availability of ATP in the body. However, the secondary purpose of growth hormone is to hold on to the structures in the body that are most important while you're in a caloric state. When you're in a caloric state, your body is going to metabolize its own bodily structures for ATP, for glucose. And what growth hormone does is to signify to very specific structures in the body to not do that. It prevents the breakdown of things like ligaments, joints, bones, and tendons while you're in a caloric deficit. Now, when it comes to optimizing growth hormone levels, the primary thing that you want to keep in mind here is to consume enough protein, and specifically the amino acids arginine, glutamine, and glycine. These these three specific amino acids appear to have a fairly potent effect on growth hormone release, and when taken and supplemented with, do appear to increase growth hormone levels. And so consuming enough protein just in general does appear to increase growth hormone levels, but increasing the intake of those specific amino acids appears to increase it even further. And so consuming these things directly before bed, or at least a couple of hours before bed, may actually help to improve the pulsatile release of growth hormone while you sleep, and secondarily improve androgen receptor function as well. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we close this video out very briefly is compounds that actually have been shown that are found in very common food sources to actually block the androgen receptor. And these would be things like polyphenols, flavonoids, isoflavones, lignans, curcumin, catechins, EGCG, resveratrol, quercetin, DIM, berberine, genistein, sulforaphane, marijuana, lycopene, and the list literally goes on and on and on. There are a ton of different compounds that are found in a very, very common foods that have been shown, at the very least in an in vitro setting, to reduce or actually block the androgen receptor. And so though there isn't enough evidence quite yet to definitively say that you shouldn't consume them for the purpose of maximizing androgen receptor function, there is enough evidence to suggest that you should be cautious of your intake of some of these plant foods and supplements. Now, I will say in general, polyphenols don't cross the gut barrier very well, and so this may not be a practical concern with food products that are high in some of these polyphenols. However, it may be enough evidence to at least caution the use of these as supplements. And so I did want to at least close this video out with mentioning that there are a ton of different compound supplements and food products that may actually completely hinder androgen receptor function and have a very negative impact on overall androgenic signaling in the body. But other than that, guys, that's pretty much all I have for this video. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Make sure to check out the link down below for 25% off of an at-home testosterone test. And if you're specifically looking for coaching help in optimizing your personal hormone profile, please feel free to reach out to me. There's a link down there for that as well. But other than that, I'll see you next time.